Welcome to Clandestine Cases. Chapter 1. It was a bitterly cold evening in late November when I, Dr. John Watson, found myself seated opposite Sherlock Holmes in the familiar confines of 221B Baker Street. The gaslight flickered against the damp window panes, casting elongated shadows upon the Persian rug. Outside, London lay shrouded in a heavy mist, muffling the occasional sound of carriage wheels upon the cobbled streets. Holmes sat in his usual repose, legs drawn up, fingers steepled beneath his sharp chin, and eyes half closed as though in a trance. A violin rested upon the arm of his chair, untouched for the past hour, a sure sign that my friend's formidable mind was already engaged in some puzzle known only to him. I had just set down my copy of the Times when an eerie sound reached my ears, causing me to sit upright. It was the unmistakable wail of bagpipes, distant yet distinct, carried upon the thick London fog. The melody was slow and mournful, almost funereal in its lament, and seemed entirely out of place in the dead of night. Holmes's eyes snapped open. He had heard it too. Curious, he murmured, tilting his head. A Highland piper in Baker Street at this hour? A most unusual circumstance, Watson. Have you noticed its peculiar rhythm? Peculiar? I echoed. It seems to be merely a dirge, melancholy, but nothing beyond the ordinary. Holmes gave a small, satisfied smile, the kind he often wore when he had already drawn a conclusion well beyond my reach. Before I could inquire further, the sound ceased abruptly, as if cut off mid-note. The silence that followed was more unsettling than the music itself. At that very moment, a sharp knock rapped against the door downstairs, urgent and insistent. Mrs. Hudson's measured footsteps echoed up the stairwell, followed by the creak of the door opening and the hushed murmur of voices. Moments later, our landlady appeared at the threshold, her face slightly pale. "A gentleman to see you, Mr. Holmes," she announced. "He appears rather troubled." Holmes straightened at once, his interest piqued. "Show him in, Mrs. Hudson." The man who entered was tall and gaunt, with hollow cheeks and eyes that darted about the room as though seeking reassurance. He removed his hat with trembling fingers, revealing a head of prematurely silvered hair. His attire, though well-tailored, bore signs of wear. An observant eye would not miss the frayed cuffs and the slight sheen of damp upon his overcoat. "Mr. Holmes," he began, his voice low and tense. "Dr. Watson, forgive my intrusion at this late hour, but I am in desperate need of your expertise. My name is Reginald Fitzhugh, and I fear I am being haunted." I raised an eyebrow at this pronouncement, but Holmes merely gestured for him to take a seat. "Haunted, Mr. Fitzhugh?" Holmes inquired, his voice betraying only the faintest trace of amusement. "I presume you are not referring to mere superstition, but rather to some tangible phenomenon." Fitzhugh leaned forward, clasping his hands tightly together. "I do not believe in ghosts, Mr. Holmes, but there is something unnatural afoot. It began 3 nights ago. At precisely midnight, I hear the sound of bagpipes outside my residence in Mayfair. It plays the same mournful tune, each night without fail. And yet when I go to investigate, there is no one there. The police dismiss it as a prank, but I fear it is something far more sinister." Holmes regarded him keenly. "And why should this concern you beyond mere inconvenience?" Fitzhugh hesitated, his Adam's apple bobbing as he swallowed. "Because, Mr. Holmes, my father was murdered in Scotland 20 years ago. The night before his death, he was plagued by the very same tune." A hush fell over the room. Even I could not dismiss such a detail as mere coincidence. Holmes's eyes gleamed with interest. "This is no ordinary case," he declared, rising abruptly. "Watson, fetch your coat. We are bound for Mayfair." Chapter 2. The mist had thickened into an impenetrable shroud by the time Sherlock Holmes and I arrived at Reginald Fitzhugh's residence in Mayfair. A stately, if somewhat weathered townhouse stood before us, its iron railings slick with moisture and its windows dark, save for a dim glow emanating from the drawing-room. The gas lamps along the street flickered uncertainly, their light barely cutting through the swirling fog. Holmes took in the surroundings with a sharp glance, his gaze lingering momentarily on a row of footprints in the damp pavement, before turning his attention to the house itself. Fitzhugh led us inside, where a modest fire struggled against the evening chill. The room bore the marks of a once prosperous household, now in decline. Ornate furniture, though well kept, showed signs of age, and a heavy air of neglect clung to the space. As we settled into our chairs, Fitzhugh poured himself a brandy with a shaking hand. "You must understand, Mr. Holmes, I am not a man easily given to fear, but the events of these past nights have left me deeply unsettled." Holmes steepled his fingers. "Let us proceed with the facts, Mr. Fitzhugh. Begin from the first occurrence of the music." Fitzhugh took a measured sip before speaking. 3 nights ago, as the clock struck 12, I was awoken by the unmistakable sound of bagpipes. At first I assumed it was some late-night revelry, but the melody was different. It was haunting, slow and sorrowful. The very same tune my father heard the night before he was killed. I could not suppress a shiver at this statement. Holmes, however, remained impassive. "You investigated, I presume?" he asked. "Of course." I threw on my dressing gown and hurried to the window. But there was no one in the street. The sound seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. When I ventured outside, the music stopped entirely. There was no sign of a piper, nor of anyone who could have played such an instrument. Holmes's expression did not waver, and this has repeated itself each night since. Without fail, always at midnight, always the same tune. Tonight, I knew I could bear it no longer. That is why I came to you." Holmes nodded, his sharp eyes gleaming with intrigue. "Then we shall see for ourselves. Watson, we shall remain here until midnight." Fitzhugh exhaled a breath of relief, though he still seemed on edge. "You have my gratitude, Mr. Holmes. If you need anything, I shall be in my study. He hesitated. "I admit I do not wish to be alone when the music begins." Holmes merely inclined his head as Fitzhugh exited the room. He then turned to me, his expression unreadable. "Watson," he murmured, "tell me, what do you make of our host?" I considered for a moment. He is clearly frightened, though whether by supernatural belief or some deeper fear, I cannot say. His story is unsettling, but I do not yet see how it connects to his father's murder 20 years ago. Holmes smiled faintly. "Nor do I, not yet, but the pattern is clear. Something or someone wishes to unnerve Fitzhugh, and they have chosen a most peculiar method. We must determine why. The clock on the mantelpiece ticked steadily as we waited. Holmes spent the intervening time in silent contemplation, his gaze fixed on the dying embers of the fire. I, on the other hand, found my nerves fraying with each passing minute. Then, as the clock struck 12, the first mournful notes of the bagpipes drifted through the air. The sound was unmistakable, low, sorrowful, and resonant. It did not come from inside the house, nor from the street, but rather from somewhere beyond, as though carried by the very mist itself. Fitzhugh reappeared at the doorway, his face pale. "You hear it, don't you?" he whispered. Holmes said nothing. He rose swiftly and moved to the window, throwing it open. The cold night air rushed in, carrying the melody with it. He listened intently, head tilted. Then, abruptly, the music ceased. Holmes did not move for a long moment. Then, with a decisive motion, he turned. "Watson, Fitzhugh, grab your coats. We are going outside." "Outside?" I echoed. Holmes's eyes flashed with certainty. "Yes, for I now know one thing for certain. Whoever is behind this wants us to believe in ghosts. And that, Watson, is always a deception worth unraveling." Chapter 3. The damp night air clung to us as we stepped outside, our breath forming. Pale ghosts in the fog. The streets of Mayfair were unnervingly silent, the glow of distant gas lamps barely penetrating the swirling mist. Holmes took the lead, his keen eyes scanning the street, his every movement precise and methodical. Reginald Fitzhugh hesitated on the threshold, his features tight with apprehension. "Mr. Holmes, I assure you, there will be nothing to see. Have searched every night and—" Holmes silenced him with a raised hand. "Observation is an art, Mr. Fitzhugh. I do not doubt that you looked, but whether you saw is another matter entirely." Fitzhugh frowned but said no more as he followed us onto the pavement. The street stretched before us, empty save for the occasional flicker of movement as the mist curled and shifted. Yet the air still held the faintest echo of the mournful bagpipes, as if the sound lingered beyond the range of human hearing. Holmes suddenly crouched near the edge of the curb, examining the damp ground with the intensity of a predator on the hunt. "Watson, observe," he murmured, pointing at a faint indentation in the moisture-slicked stone. "Footprints, light, deliberate, and recent." I leaned in. The marks were barely visible, yet distinct enough upon close inspection. They led away from Fitzhugh's house, curving toward a narrow alleyway between two stately buildings. "Someone was standing here," Holmes continued, his voice measured. "And not long ago. They positioned themselves precisely where the sound would carry. But the moment we emerged, they vanished into the fog." Fitzhugh swallowed hard. But where could they have gone so quickly? Holmes straightened. "That is what we shall determine. Come." With that, he strode forward, his coat billowing slightly as he moved with swift precision. I followed, my hand instinctively brushing against the revolver in my pocket. Fitzhugh, reluctant but determined, brought up the rear. The alleyway swallowed us in darkness, the gaslight from the main road failing to reach its depths. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the distant drip of water and the occasional scurry of unseen vermin. Holmes slowed. "Watson," he whispered, "do you smell that?" I inhaled sharply. A faint scent lingered in the air. something sharp and acrid with a strange metallic tang. Sulphur? I ventured. Holmes nodded. Precisely. And do you recall where else we have encountered such a scent? I frowned, searching my memory. Then it struck me. Gunpowder. Holmes's smile was fleeting but approving. A most unusual presence in a deserted alley at midnight, wouldn't you say? Before I could respond, a sudden movement ahead caught my eye. A shadow shifted. There, just beyond the reach of the dim light. Holmes, I began, but he had already seen it. In an instant he was moving, his long stride swift and precise. Fitzhugh let out a startled gasp as Holmes surged forward, disappearing into the mist. I hurried after him, my heart pounding. For a moment, I lost him. Then, as I turned the corner, I saw Holmes standing utterly still, his gaze fixed upon something at his feet. A small bundle of fabric lay in the alleyway, half hidden in the shadows. Holmes crouched and lifted it carefully. It was a tattered scrap of tartan cloth, damp with the night's mist, but unmistakably Scottish in design. "The piper's disguise," Holmes murmured, turning it over in his hands. "Discarded in haste. Fitzhugh, breathless from the chase, caught up with us." "What does it mean?" he demanded. "Who would go to such lengths to frighten me?" Holmes did not answer immediately. He turned the cloth in his hands once more before tucking it into his coat pocket. "That, Mr. Fitzhugh, is precisely what we shall uncover. But I can tell you this, whoever our phantom piper is, they are no spirit. They are flesh and blood, and they have a purpose far beyond mere haunting." He straightened, his sharp gaze sweeping the alley one final time, before turning back toward the house. "Come, Watson. I believe it is time we took a closer look into the past, beginning with the murder of Fitzhugh's father." Chapter 4. The journey back to Baker Street was a silent one, each of us lost in our own thoughts. Fitzhugh, visibly shaken, sat opposite me in the cab, staring absently at his gloved hands. Holmes, meanwhile, was as unreadable as ever, his sharp profile illuminated only by the occasional flicker of passing gas lamps. I knew better than to interrupt his thoughts. At last, as we neared 221B, he spoke. "Watson, I trust you recall the bare particulars of Fitzhugh's father's murder." I frowned, casting my mind back. "I cannot say that I do." "It was 20 years ago, you said." Holmes nodded. "A case that never reached my desk, though it should have. But we shall remedy that now." Soon as we arrived, Holmes wasted no time. He strode to his desk, retrieved a thick volume from a shelf, and began flipping through its yellowed pages. I recognized it at once. His personal archive of unsolved cases, newspaper clippings, and police reports he had collected over the years. Fitzhugh watched with wary anticipation. "You believe the answer lies in my father's murder?" "I believe," Holmes corrected, "that the past and the present are rarely as separate as we imagine." "Ah, here we are." He pulled a newspaper clipping from between the pages and laid it on the high table. I leaned in, scanning the brittle print. "Scottish landowner found dead. Murder or tragedy. The body of Alistair Fitzhugh, a wealthy estate owner, was discovered in his study late last evening at his Highland estate. The local authorities have declared the death to be a result of natural causes, though some close to the deceased suspect foul play. The victim's son, Reginald Fitzhugh, aged 16, was the first to discover the body. No suspects have been named, and the case remains officially closed. I looked up. This tells us little. Holmes tapped the page. On the contrary, Watson, it tells us quite a bit. Note the official cause of death, natural causes. And yet, some suspect foul play. A contradiction, is it not? Fitzhugh exhaled slowly. I never believed it was natural, Mr. Holmes. My father was a strong man. One evening, he was in perfect health. The next, he was dead. The doctor ruled it as a sudden heart failure, but He hesitated. I always felt there was more to it. Holmes studied him carefully. Tell me everything you remember of that night. Fitzhugh hesitated before answering. It was late. The household had retired for the night. I was restless wandering the halls when I heard something strange. Bagpipes playing outside. Holmes and I exchanged glances. The same melody? Holmes asked. Fitzhugh nodded. I remember it distinctly. It woke my father too. I heard him stirring in his study, but I did not go to him immediately. When I finally did, he was slumped over his desk, gone. His voice tightened. No sign of a struggle, no wounds. The doctor claimed his heart simply failed, but something in me has never accepted that explanation. Holmes pressed his fingertips together, deep in thought. You were 16 at the time. Who else was in the house? My father's manservant, Mr. O'Malley. A few household staff. My uncle, Wallace Fitzhugh, was visiting as well. Your uncle? Yes, my father's younger brother. They were not close, but he had come on business concerning the estate. Holmes's eyes gleamed with interest. And where is this uncle now? Fitzhugh hesitated. He lives in London. Holmes gave a small smile, as if that fact had confirmed a suspicion. How convenient. You think, I think, Holmes interrupted, that there is a connection between your father's death and the events of these past nights, and I do not believe in coincidences. He stood abruptly. Come, Watson. It seems we have an appointment to make with Mr. Wallace Fitzhugh. Chapter 5. The morning dawned cold and grey, the mist still reluctant to lift from the streets of London. Over breakfast, Holmes remained uncharacteristically silent, his fingers drumming lightly against the table as he turned over the problem in his mind. Fitzhugh, clearly uneasy, had barely touched his meal. Watson, Holmes finally said, rising from his chair. I believe it is time we paid Mr. Wallace Fitzhugh a visit. Reginald Fitzhugh looked up sharply. You think my uncle is involved in this? Holmes gave a slight shrug. I think your uncle was present at a moment of great importance and has conveniently removed himself from further inquiries. Whether he is involved or not, we shall determine soon enough. A meeting with the Uncle Wallace Fitzhugh resided in a stately home on Cavendish Square, an address that spoke of wealth and careful investment. As we approached the grand townhouse, Holmes took in every detail. The polished brass of the door knocker, the absence of dust on the steps, the way the curtains on the second-floor window twitched ever so slightly as we arrived. Holmes gave me a sidelong glance. We are expected. A footman answered our knock, and after a moment's hesitation, led us into a study lined with dark mahogany shelves. The scent of aged paper and pipe smoke filled the air. At the desk sat Wallace Fitzhugh, a broad-shouldered man with greying hair, and a sharp, calculating gaze. He did not rise as we entered, but instead leaned back, watching us with thinly veiled curiosity. "Sherlock Holmes," he said smoothly, "and Dr. Watson, I presume. To what do I owe the pleasure?" Holmes did not answer immediately. Instead, he moved toward the fireplace, examining the framed portrait above it. A painting of a man who bore an uncanny resemblance to Reginald Fitzhugh, the elder Fitzhugh. "You keep your brother's likeness close," Holmes remarked. Wallace Fitzhugh's expression did not change. "Alistair was my brother after all. His loss was unfortunate." "Unfortunate indeed," Holmes murmured, turning back to face him. "Tell me, Mr. Fitzhugh, do you still enjoy the sound of bagpipes?" For the briefest moment, Wallace Fitzhugh's fingers clenched against the armrest. Then he forced a chuckle. "Bagpipes? Hardly my taste. Why do you ask?" Holmes gave him a piercing look. "Because someone has been playing a most mournful tune outside your nephew's house. A tune identical to the one heard on the night of your brother's death." The room fell into a heavy silence. Wallace Fitzhugh's gaze flickered toward Reginald, whose expression was a mixture of suspicion and barely concealed grief. "My dear Mr. Holmes," Wallace said at last, shaking his head, "surely you cannot think I had anything to do with that nonsense? I was as shocked as anyone when my brother passed away." "Shocked but not grieved," Holmes said mildly. Wallace's eyes narrowed. "You presume much, sir." Holmes smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "I presume nothing, I observe. You were the last person to see your brother alive, were you not?" Wallace exhaled, shifting in his chair. "We had words that night, yes. A disagreement over the inheritance. Alistair intended to make some changes to his will. I strongly advised him against it." "Ah," Holmes said softly. "And did he heed your advice?" Wallace hesitated. "No. He insisted on calling his solicitor the very next morning. But of course, he never had the chance." Another silence fell over the room. It was Fitzhugh who broke it. "You knew," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "You knew he was changing his will and the next morning he was dead?" Wallace's jaw tightened. "Watch your words, Reginald. I had no hand in my brother's death." Holmes studied him for a long moment before nodding. "Perhaps not. But I believe there is more to this story than you admit." He turned sharply toward the door. "Come, Watson. We have another call to make, this time to Scotland Yard." Wallace Fitzhugh stood abruptly. "Scotland Yard?" he scoffed. "On what grounds?" Holmes paused at the threshold. "A man murdered 20 years ago. An inheritance left in limbo. And now someone seeks to frighten his heir with the echoes of the past. I think Scotland Yard will be most interested, Mr. Fitzhugh. Most interested indeed." Chapter 6. The hansom cab rattled through the damp streets as Holmes, Fitzhugh and I made our way to Scotland Yard. Fitzhugh sat stiffly beside me, his hands clenched into fists. Holmes, on the other hand, appeared utterly at ease, gazing out at the fog-shrouded city with an air of mild amusement. "You truly believe my uncle is involved in this?" Fitzhugh asked at last, his voice low. Holmes did not turn from the window. "I believe your uncle is not a man given to sentiment. And I believe he had both motive and opportunity when your father died. Whether he is directly responsible for these recent events, however, remains to be seen. Fitzhugh exhaled sharply. And Scotland Yard, what do you hope to gain there? Holmes finally turned to him. An old case leaves traces, my dear Fitzhugh, and I intend to follow them to their end. An unsolved case. Revisited at Scotland Yard, we were met by Inspector Lestrade, a man whose wiry frame and perpetually exasperated demeanour had become familiar to both Holmes and myself over the years. He greeted us with a wary nod. "Holmes," he said, rubbing his temples as though he already had a headache, "to what do I owe this pleasure?" Holmes smiled thinly. A 20-year-old case, Lestrade. One that should have been solved long ago. Lestrade raised an eyebrow, but gestured for us to follow. In a dimly lit archive room, dust motes danced in the air as he pulled out an aged file. "Alistair Fitzhugh," he muttered, flipping through the yellowed pages. "Died at his estate in Scotland. Official ruling, heart failure. No evidence of foul play. Case closed." Holmes reached out and plucked a sheet from the file. "And yet, here we have the coroner's report, remarkably vague, wouldn't you say? No detailed examination, no toxicology test." Lestrade sighed. "It was 20 years ago, Holmes. Medical examinations weren't as thorough as they are now." "Convenient," Holmes murmured. He scanned another page. And here, a statement from one Mr. O'Malley, the manservant. He claimed he heard raised voices before the death, yet no investigation followed. Lestrade frowned. "You think this was a murder?" Holmes looked at him over the edge of the file. "I think a man set to change his will, conveniently dying before he could do so, is more than mere coincidence." Lestrade drummed his fingers against the table. "If you're right, what do you expect to find after all this time?" Holmes smiled. "A trail. Every crime leaves one, Lestrade, even those that have long gone cold." Lestrade exhaled. "Fine. What do you need?" Holmes closed the file and straightened. "A list of all known associates of Wallace Fitzhugh at the time of his brother's death, and access to any recent reports of disturbances near Reginald Fitzhugh's residence. Perhaps incidents dismissed as minor, but of particular interest to us." Lestrade sighed again, but nodded. "I'll see what I can do. But Holmes, don't expect a confession after 20 years. Holmes chuckled. "A confession, my dear Lestrade, is only one way to catch a criminal. Fortunately, it is not the only way." An ominous discovery as we left Scotland Yard. Holmes was deep in thought. Fitzhugh, still uneasy, turned to him. "And what now? You seem certain my uncle played a role in my father's death. But how does this connect to the Piper?" Holmes stepped into the waiting cab and gave a small, knowing smile. "A puzzle, isn't it? And yet, I believe we are close to the solution. First, we must find O'Malley, the last man to see your father alive. If he is still living, he may hold the missing piece." Fitzhugh paled. "And if he isn't?" Holmes's expression darkened slightly. "Then we shall have to ask why." The cab clattered forward, carrying us into the deepening mist of London, toward an answer that had waited 20 years to be uncovered. Chapter 7. The search for O'Malley led us to a modest lodging house in the East End of London, a stark contrast to the grand estates of Mayfair. The building was old and ill-maintained, its facade worn by years of London's certain rain. Holmes approached the door with measured confidence and rapped twice. After a moment, shuffling footsteps sounded from within. The door creaked open just a fraction, revealing a weary-lined face framed by unkempt white hair. The man behind it was gaunt, his sharp blue eyes dulled with age, yet still carrying a flicker of suspicion. "Are you O'Malley?" Holmes asked without preamble. The old man's eyes narrowed. "Who's asking?" "Someone with questions about Alistair Fitzhugh." A flicker of recognition passed over the man's face. For a brief moment, I thought he might shut the door on us. But something in Holmes's steady gaze gave him pause. "Monsieur," a heavy sigh, he stepped back. "Come in then. But if you've come looking for ghosts, you won't find them here. A story from the past." The room was sparse. A single chair near the fireplace, and a rickety table against the wall. O'Malley eased himself into the chair with a groan, rubbing his knotted hands together. "Been 20 years since I left that place," he muttered, "and I hoped never to hear the name Fitzhugh again." Holmes took a step forward. "And yet, Mr. O'Malley, something tells me you've thought of that night more times than you'd care to admit." The old man let out a bitter chuckle. "Aye, and if I had spoken back then, I might have lost more than my place in that house." He glanced at Fitzhugh. "You're the boy, aren't you? Alistair's lad?" Fitzhugh nodded stiffly. "I am." O'Malley exhaled slowly. "Then you deserve to know the truth." The room fell silent as he gathered his thoughts. Finally, he spoke. "Dew was a cold night, colder than most. The house was quiet. Master Alistair had retired to his study, like he always did, with his ledgers and his whiskey. I was finishing my rounds when I heard voices, his and your uncle's." Fitzhugh stiffened. "My uncle was with him." O'Malley nodded. "Aye, and it wasn't a friendly conversation. I didn't catch every word, but what I heard chilled me. Wallace was furious about something. Said Alistair was making a mistake, that he'd regret it. Alistair stood firm, told Wallace his decision was final." Holmes tilted his head slightly. "And what was that decision?" O'Malley sighed. "He was changing his will. Said Wallace wasn't to get a penny. Everything was to go to Reginald." A sharp silence followed. Fitzhugh's breath hitched slightly, but he said nothing. "And then?" Holmes pressed. O'Malley's gaze grew distant. "Then came the music. I sat forward. The bagpipes. A slow, mournful tune, drifting in from the night. I stepped to the window, but I couldn't see anything in the fog. And when I turned back, Wallace was leaving the study, his face dark as thunder. I didn't dare ask what had happened. He left the house that night, and I never saw him again." Holmes's expression remained unreadable. "And when did you find Alistair?" "Not long after," O'Malley said hoarsely. Slumped over his desk, his glass of whiskey spilled beside him. No wound, no struggle, just gone. He swallowed. "The doctor called it a heart failure, but I always wondered, did Wallace do something, or was it something else?" Holmes was silent for a long moment. Then he said, "And yet, Mr. O'Malley, you said nothing." O'Malley's hands clenched on the armrest. What could I say? The doctor had ruled it natural. There was no mark on the body, No sign of poison. If I accused Wallace, I'd have been thrown out with nothing but suspicions. Fitzhugh's voice was tight. And yet you knew. O'Malley sighed again, this time with the weight of 2 decades of regret. I knew. A new perspective. Holmes turned to Fitzhugh. Nina, and now you know as well. Fitzhugh exhaled, his expression unreadable. But what of the piper? Who is tormenting me now? Holmes's gaze flickered with something keen. That, my dear Fitzhugh, is the final question. Someone wants you to remember that night, and the answer, I suspect, is much closer than we think. He turned back to O'Malley. One last question. Did Wallace ever return to Scotland after Alistair's death? O'Malley shook his head. Not once. Holmes nodded, then turned toward the door. Then it is time we found out who has. Chapter 8. As we stepped out into the cold, damp air of London's East End, Fitzhugh's face was a mask of barely contained anger. His breath came in short, sharp bursts, misting in the frigid night. He knew, he muttered. O'Malley knew all these years and said nothing. My father's murderer walked free, and no one did a damn thing. Holmes placed a firm hand on Fitzhugh's shoulder. Revenge and justice are not the same, my dear Fitzhugh. The former blinds a man. The latter must be pursued with precision. Fitzhugh turned on him. And what do you intend to do? Wallace was there. He threatened my father. Who else could it have been? Holmes gave him a level look. I admit your uncle is a prime suspect, but I am not yet convinced he was the one who delivered the final blow. Fitzhugh exhaled, running a hand through his disheveled hair. Hence. Then who? Holmes's eyes gleamed. That, my dear fellow, is precisely what we are about to discover. A visit to the piper's past. Instead of returning to Baker Street, Holmes directed our cab toward the British Museum Library. At this late hour, the library itself was closed, but Holmes, ever prepared, had connections in every corner of London. A few words with the night attendant secured us entry. Fitzhugh frowned as we followed Holmes through the dimly lit aisles. What exactly are we looking for? Holmes stopped abruptly, running his fingers along a row of bound records. Newspaper archives, he murmured. I have often said, Watson, that a man's past is never truly buried. If the piper is trying to resurrect old ghosts, we must first understand the melody they play. He pulled a volume from the shelf and flipped through the pages with astonishing speed, his keen eyes scanning each one. After a few minutes, he stopped, his lips curling into a satisfied smile. Here we are, he announced, turning the book toward us. I stepped forward and read aloud. Mysterious Death of Scottish Bagpiper. 1879. Ian McTavish, a well-known Highland piper, was found dead under suspicious circumstances near Inverness. Known for his deep loyalty to the Fitzhugh estate, McTavish had once served as a personal musician to the late Lord Fitzhugh. His death was ruled an accident, though some believe foul play was involved. Witnesses claim he had been drinking heavily the night before his body was discovered at the foot of a rocky hill. His widow, Myra McTavish, later left the Highlands and disappeared from public records. Fitzhugh's brows furrowed. McTavish. I've heard that name before. My father spoke of him when I was a child. Holmes nodded. Indeed, a loyal servant of the Fitzhugh family. But look here, Watson. His widow disappeared. An unusual detail, wouldn't you say? I frowned. You think she had a reason to vanish? Holmes snapped the book shut. I think it is a remarkable coincidence that a man associated with the Fitzhugh estate perished under suspicious circumstances, just as Alistair Fitzhugh did years later. And now, someone plays the pipes outside our friend's home. No ghost, Watson, but a very real person carrying a message. Fitzhugh's voice was tight. You believe the piper is related to McTavish? Holmes's eyes gleamed. The widow disappeared. But what if she did not disappear alone? What if she had a child? A heavy silence followed his words. Then Fitzhugh muttered, if you're right, then the piper isn't just playing to frighten me. He's playing for revenge. Holmes nodded. And now we must find him before he strikes again. A shadow in the mist, we hurried out of the British Museum and hailed a cab, heading straight for Fitzhugh's residence in Mayfair. As we approached, the street was eerily silent, the gas lamps flickering in the dense fog. Holmes stepped out first, his sharp eyes sweeping the area. Something is amiss, he muttered. Fitzhugh stiffened. What do you mean? Holmes crouched and ran his fingers over the damp pavement. The footprints from last night. There are new ones, fresh ones. I felt a cold prickle at the back of my neck. You mean? Holmes rose swiftly. The piper is already here. At that moment, the first low, haunting notes of the bagpipes drifted through the night, the same mournful tune carrying through the mist like a funeral dirge. But this time it was closer, much closer. From the shadows of a nearby alley, a figure stepped forward, the pipes still wailing in his hands. He was tall, wrapped in a heavy cloak, his face obscured beneath the shadow of a hood. Fitzhugh's breath caught. Who are you? The figure lowered the pipes. Then, in a voice that sent a shiver through me, he spoke. I am the son of Ian McTavish, and I have come to claim what was stolen from my family. Holmes's eyes gleamed with triumph. At last, he murmured, the ghost shows its face. Chapter 9. The thick London mist clung to us as we stood motionless, staring at the hooded figure. The man's voice was low and steady, carrying the weight of something long buried. I am the son of Ian McTavish, he repeated, and I have waited 20 years for this moment. Holmes took a slow step forward, his eyes fixed upon the piper with keen intensity. And what is it precisely that you seek? The man's grip tightened around the bagpipes. Justice, he spat, for my father, for my mother, for the life stolen from them. Fitzhugh's face was a mask of confusion and unease. I don't understand, he said. What do you want with me? The piper's eyes, dark and burning with fury, landed on him. Your father, he said coldly, was a murderer. A stunned silence followed. Fitzhugh flinched as though he had been struck. That's impossible, he whispered. My father was an honorable man. Holmes interrupted, his voice calm, but firm. Enough, Fitzhugh, let the man speak. The piper exhaled sharply, his fingers trembling slightly as he clutched his instrument. My father, Ian McTavish, was loyal to your family, devoted to the Fitzhugh estate. But one night, he overheard something. Something he was never meant to hear. Holmes's eyes gleamed. Let me guess. Alistair Fitzhugh and Wallace Fitzhugh. A discussion of inheritance, perhaps. The piper's mouth had twisted into a grim smile. Exactly. My father heard Wallace threaten Alistair. He knew Wallace intended to stop the will from changing by any means necessary. Fitzhugh's voice was barely above a whisper. You're saying my uncle murdered my father? The piper nodded. He knew what Wallace planned to do. He tried to warn Alistair, but before he could, he was silenced. A cold chill ran down my spine. Silenced. Poisoned, the piper said simply. A slow, undetectable poison slipped into his drink. The coroner called it an accident, blamed the whiskey, but my mother knew. She knew. Holmes inhaled deeply, and so she fled, took you with her, to protect you. The piper's hands clenched. She died in exile, alone, broken, stripped of everything. And for 20 years, Wallace lived as a free man, wealthy, untouchable, while my family was left with nothing but the memory of betrayal. Holmes tilted his head slightly. And so you decided to return, to remind the last Fitzhugh of what had been done. The piper's jaw tightened. To do more than remind Mr. Holmes, to take back what was stolen. Holmes's final deduction. Fitzhugh took a staggering step backward. You mean to kill me? The piper exhaled sharply. I mean to take back my father's honor. The Fitzhugh estate should have been his, not Wallace's. I will see the line corrected. Holmes, who had been studying the piper with his usual, unreadable expression, suddenly chuckled. The sound was so unexpected, so out of place, that even the piper hesitated. You find this amusing? Holmes shook his head. Not in the least, my dear fellow. Only tragic. The piper's expression darkened. And what, exactly, is so tragic about justice? Holmes's gaze sharpened. Because you are pursuing the wrong enemy. Thence, Piper narrowed his eyes. Explain yourself. Holmes took a measured step closer. You believe Wallace Fitzhugh murdered your father to keep the estate. That part, I agree, is likely true. But you assume that Alistair Fitzhugh was innocent in all. Of this, the piper scoffed. He was a victim. Holmes shook his head. No. He was a man who saw what was coming and did nothing. He turned to Fitzhugh. Your father knew his life was in danger, yet he made no effort to stop his brother. Why? Fitzhugh's face was stricken. I don't know. Holmes's voice was firm. Because he thought himself untouchable. Because he believed that even if Wallace killed McTavish, he himself would never be harmed. He allowed an innocent man to die, to save himself. The piper stood motionless, his expression unreadable. Holmes continued. So tell me, McTavish, what justice do you seek? Wallace Fitzhugh is still alive. He is the murderer. He is the one who profited from this crime. And yet, here you stand, ready to punish the wrong man. The piper's hands trembled. Holmes took another step forward. Killing Reginald Fitzhugh will not bring your father back, and it will not bring you peace. A tense silence filled the fog-drenched air. The piper's breath was ragged, his fingers tightening around the pipes. For a moment, I feared he would strike, then slowly, his grip slackened. Holmes exhaled. Come, McTavish, the true enemy awaits. The true confrontation. An hour later, we stood once more in Wallace Fitzhugh's grand townhouse. Wallace sat in his study, the firelight casting flickering shadows across his face. He sipped his brandy, utterly calm, until he saw the man standing beside Holmes, the glass in his hand shattered against the floor. "You," he breathed. McTavish stepped forward. Me." Wallace's face paled. He rose quickly, but Holmes held up a hand. "Sit down, Wallace." Wallace hesitated, then slowly lowered himself into his chair. His composure returned quickly, but his eyes darted between Holmes and the piper. "I see you've been digging, Mr. Holmes." Holmes smiled slightly. And what rich soil it was. Wallace exhaled. "What do you want?" McTavish's voice was cold as steel. "The truth." Wallace's lips curled. "What good will the truth do you now?" Holmes answered for him. "Enough to see justice done." Wallace laughed, though there was no humor in it. "And how do you intend to prove a murder that happened 20 years ago?" Holmes's expression remained unreadable. "Oh, I imagine the newspapers will have a field day. A man playing the same tune before two deaths, 20 years apart. A missing witness who has just resurfaced. That's enough for Scotland Yard to take an interest, don't you think?" Wallace's bravado cracked. He rose suddenly. "This is absurd. There is no evidence." Holmes took a step closer. "But you're afraid, aren't you? Because you know the truth, Wallace, and so do we." Wallace's hands clenched at his sides. His mouth opened as if to speak, but no words came. McTavish exhaled, slowly. "You took my father's life, and you took everything from my family." Wallace's eyes darted toward the door, as though weighing his chances of escape. Holmes's voice was soft but firm. "It's over, Wallace." Silence stretched between them. Then, slowly, Wallace slumped into his chair. He knew he was finished, and at long last, the past had caught up with him. Chapter 10. The silence in Wallace Fitzhugh's study was thick with finality. He sat motionless, his hands gripping the arms of his chair, as though they were the only thing anchoring him to reality. The flickering firelight cast long shadows over his face, emphasizing the deep lines of a man whose sins had finally caught up with him. Sherlock Holmes stood beside the desk, his sharp gaze unwavering. "It is over, Wallace. Scotland Yard will be most interested in hearing your confession." Wallace scoffed, though his voice was hoarse. "And if I refuse to confess?" Holmes smiled faintly. "Then we shall let the press decide your guilt. The story of a man accused of fratricide, tied to a long-forgotten death, and a mysterious bagpiper haunting London. Well, that will make quite the sensation, don't you think?" Wallace's expression darkened. He knew Holmes was right. Fitzhugh, standing a few steps away, finally found his voice. "You let my father die. You murdered McTavish to keep him silent. And then you took everything that should have been mine." Wallace's lips curled into something resembling a sneer. "And what will you do about it, boy? Have me hanged?" McTavish took a slow step forward. His face was unreadable, his bagpipes hanging loosely from his hands. "No," he said, his voice as steady as the wind outside. "I have already done what I came here to do." Wallace's brows furrowed. What nonsense is this? McTavish exhaled, his fingers ghosting over the worn wood of his pipes. For 20 years I have carried my father's grief. I have lived in the shadow of a crime that went unpunished, seeking vengeance that I thought would bring peace. But standing here now, I see the truth. He turned to Holmes, then to Fitzhugh. Justice is not mine to deliver. I have played my song. I have reminded the world of what was done. And now Wallace Fitzhugh will face the judgment of men. Holmes watched him keenly. A wise choice, McTavish. McTavish met Wallace's gaze one final time. You will not see me again. Then, without another word, he turned and walked out of the study, his bagpipes silent at his side. The reckoning Holmes turned to Fitzhugh. Your next step, I trust, is clear. Fitzhugh straightened. I will see that Wallace is held accountable. Scotland Yard will have no choice but to investigate now. Holmes nodded. Then our work here is done. Wallace did not resist as we left, though the look in his eyes was one of cold hatred. He was a man undone, his carefully crafted world crumbling beneath the weight of long-buried secrets. As we stepped out into the misty streets of London, the air felt lighter somehow, as if the ghosts of the past had finally been laid to rest. Fitzhugh inhaled deeply, then turned to Holmes. I don't know how to thank you. Holmes gave a small, knowing smile. No thanks are necessary, my dear Fitzhugh. The truth was always there, waiting to be uncovered. I looked at Holmes as we walked toward Baker Street. And what of McTavish? Holmes glanced toward the distance, where the faintest echo of bagpipes could be heard, drifting away into the night. He is free now, Watson. The song has been played. The past no longer holds him. And with that, we disappeared into the London fog. Another case closed, another mystery unraveled.